When Colt Brennan found two children half dead in the poisoned wasteland, where nothing was supposed to survive, he had no idea they would whisper a name that had been buried with his wife 3 years ago. What happened next would challenge everything. He believed about fate, family, and the mysterious ways the frontier could heal a man's shattered soul. The wasteland stretched endlessly under a merciless August sun, a scarred expanse of alkali flats and twisted mesquite that even the buzzards seemed to avoid. This was the kind of country that broke men's spirits before it broke their bodies, where the very air tasted of salt and desperation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colt Brennan knew this land intimately, had fought it for the better part of 15 years, and understood why most folks called it the Devil's Garden. Nothing good ever came from the wasteland, nothing except the cattle that somehow managed to survive on the sparse grass that grew along its edges, tough as leather and twice as valuable because of it. Colt sat astride his steel-grey gelding Jasper, surveying the herd that had wandered too close to the wasteland's edge. The cattle were restless today, their heads lifted high, nostrils flaring as they caught some scent on the wind that made them nervous. Jasper shifted beneath him, ears twitching forward towards something Colt couldn't yet see. The horse had better instincts than most men Colt had known, and when Jasper got edgy, there was usually good reason for it. The sun was already past its peak, casting short shadows across the cracked earth. Colt pulled his weathered hat lower over his eyes and urged Jasper forward, the leather of his saddle creaking with the familiar rhythm of a man who had spent more hours on horseback than on his own 2 feet. His cattle brand, the Double Bar B, was burned into the flanks of nearly 200 head scattered across this godforsaken stretch of northern Texas territory. It wasn't prime grazing land by any stretch, but it was his, bought with blood and sweat and the last of his savings after the war ended. That war felt like a lifetime ago now, though the memories still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. The screaming of horses, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the weight of decisions that sent good men to their graves. He'd been Captain Brennan then, leading a company of Texas cavalry through some of the worst fighting the Confederate cause had to offer. When it was over, when the South had bled itself white and the surrender papers were signed, Colt had come home to find his world as broken as his country. The ranch house sat 2 miles back from where he rode now, a sturdy structure of timber and stone that he'd built with his own hands in the summer of 1867. It had been meant to be a home for two, with rooms for the children he and Sarah had planned to fill it with. Instead, it had become a monument to dreams that died with her, as empty and silent as a church on a Monday morning. Sarah Brennan, née Sarah McKinnon, had been the daughter of a Scottish immigrant who'd struck it rich in the California gold fields before moving to Texas to buy land. She'd been beautiful in the way that wildflowers are beautiful, delicate, but somehow perfectly suited to the harsh environment that would have withered lesser women. They'd had 3 good years together before the fever took her. 3 years of building something real in this unforgiving country, of planning for a future that stretched out like an endless prairie, full of possibility. Sarah had been pregnant when she died, and Colt had buried 2 dreams in that windswept cemetery outside town. He'd carved the headstone himself, his hands steady despite the tears that wouldn't seem to stop falling. Sarah McKinnon Brennan, beloved wife, 1845-1870. She made the desert bloom. The headstone was the last thing he'd crafted with love. Everything since had been built out of necessity, routine, the simple need to keep moving forward because standing still meant drowning in memories that cut deeper than any Confederate saber ever had. He worked his cattle, maintained his property, made his trips to town for supplies, and spoke to other human beings only when commerce or courtesy demanded it. The folks in Copper Ridge, the nearest settlement, had stopped trying to draw him into their community gatherings. They understood, in the way that frontier people understood hard losses, that some men needed to grieve in their own time and their own way. But understanding didn't make the loneliness any easier to bear. The ranch house echoed with his footsteps, and sometimes, in the deep of night, he could swear he heard Sarah's voice calling his name from the next room. He'd learned to stop answering, learned to let the sound wash over him like wind through the eaves, but it never stopped hurting. There were nights when he'd saddle Jasper and ride out into the wasteland just to get away from the silence, to put some distance between himself and the ghosts that lived in every corner of the home they'd built together. The cattle were definitely agitated now, milling about in tight circles and lowing in the particular way that meant they'd encountered something that didn't belong. Colt could see the problem as he rode closer. A section of fence had been cut, the wire ends twisted back to create an opening just wide enough for a man to pass through. This wasn't the work of weather or wandering animals. Someone had deliberately breached his property line, and from the look of the ground around the opening, they'd done it recently. Jasper snorted and danced sideways as they approached the gap. The horse's behavior was growing more pronounced, and Colt found himself reaching for the Winchester rifle that hung in its scabbard alongside his right stirrup. He'd learned during the war to trust his instincts, and right now every instinct he possessed was screaming that something was very wrong with this picture. The cuts in the wire were clean, made with proper tools rather than the rough tears that would result from desperate hands or makeshift implements. Whoever had done this had come prepared. He dismounted and knelt beside the fence, running his fingers along the cut ends of the wire. The metal was bright where it had been severed, indicating that the damage was fresh, probably made within the last day or two. But why would anyone want to cut into his property from the Wasteland side? There was nothing out there but poisoned ground and the occasional alkali spring that would kill a man as soon as water him. The land beyond his fence belonged to no one and everyone, a stretch of territory too worthless for even the government to claim. That's when he heard it, a sound so faint and unexpected that at first he thought it might be the wind playing tricks on his ears. It was a voice, thin and high and unmistakably human, calling from somewhere deeper in the wasteland. Colt stood slowly, his hand still resting on the rifle stock, and strained to hear it again. There it came, carried on the dry breeze like a prayer whispered in an empty church. It was a child's voice, and it was calling for help. Colt's heart hammered against his ribs as he climbed back into the saddle. A child, out there in the wasteland where nothing could survive for long. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, and once darkness fell, the temperature would drop 40 degrees. The wasteland was a furnace during the day and an icebox at night, and even a healthy adult would struggle to survive more than a few hours without proper shelter and supplies. He guided Jasper through the gap in the fence and out into the wasteland. Proper. The ground here was different, covered in a fine layer of alkali dust that rose in small clouds with each step. The vegetation was sparse and stunted, consisting mainly of salt-tolerant plants that looked more like grey skeletons than living things. This was a landscape that spoke of ancient lakes dried to nothing, of groundwater so laden with minerals that it could preserve a man's body for decades while slowly poisoning his spirit. The voice came again, closer now, and Colt was able to determine its direction. He urged Jasper forward, following what might generously be called a trail through the twisted remains of long-dead trees. The path wound between alkali mounds and patches of ground so white they hurt to look at, leading deeper into a part of the territory that even the Apache had abandoned generations ago. As they rode, Colt found himself thinking about Sarah and the children they'd never had. She'd wanted a large family, had spoken often of filling their house with the sounds of laughter and running feet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. "This land needs young voices," she told him once, standing on their front porch and looking out over the endless expanse of grass and sky. "It's too quiet, Colt. Too lonely. Children would wake it up, make it remember what it's supposed to be for." He'd agreed with her then, had shared her vision of a future filled with the chaos and joy that only children could bring. They'd even begun to prepare for that future. Sarah spending hours planning nurseries and Colt building furniture with his own hands. He still had the cradle he'd carved from oak, stored now in the back room of the house like a monument to hopes that had been buried with his wife. Sometimes he thought about burning it, putting an end to the daily reminder of what he'd lost, but he could never bring himself to strike the match. The trail began to descend into a shallow depression, and it was there that Colt saw them. Two children, huddled together in the shade of an overhanging rock formation, their clothes torn and their faces streaked with dirt and tears. The older of the two, a girl who couldn't have been more than 10 years old, was trying to shield the younger child from the sun with her own body. The boy, perhaps 6 or 7, lay motionless in her arms, his lips cracked and his breathing shallow. Colt's throat went dry as he took in the scene. These children were dying slowly and terribly in one of the most unforgiving places on earth. He could see from their condition that they'd been here for at least a day, maybe longer, surviving on nothing but whatever water they'd been able to carry and the desperate hope that someone would find them before it was too late. He dismounted and approached them slowly, not wanting to frighten them further than they already were. The girl looked up at him, with eyes that held far too much knowledge for someone her age, eyes that had seen things no child should ever have to witness. She didn't speak, but her gaze held a mixture of hope and wariness that spoke of hard lessons. "Learned about trusting strangers." "Easy there, little miss," Colt said softly, kneeling down a few feet away from them. "I'm not going to hurt you. My name's Colt Brennan, and I've got water and food back at my place. Can you tell me your names?" The girl's voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. "I'm Emma," she said, then looked down at the boy in her arms. "This is my brother, Samuel. He's really sick, mister. He hasn't had water since yesterday morning." Colt's chest tightened as he looked at the boy. Samuel's skin was flushed with fever, and his breathing had the shallow, rapid quality that spoke of severe dehydration. Without immediate help, the child would be dead before morning. "How long have you been out here, Emma?" Colt asked, already reaching for the canteen that hung from his saddle. 2 days, I think," Emma replied, her voice growing stronger now. That help had arrived. "Maybe 3, it's hard to remember. We were with our mama, but she—" Her voice trailed off, and she looked away toward the horizon. Colt felt something cold settle in his stomach. "Where's your mama now, honey?" Emma's shoulders began to shake, and when she spoke again, her words came out in a broken whisper. "The bad men took her. They said they were going to sell her to someone in Mexico. Said we were too much trouble to bother with. They left us here and said the desert would take care of us." The coldness in Colt's chest spread outward, turning into a rage so pure and focused that it took all his self-control not to curse aloud. Someone had deliberately abandoned these children to die, had used the Wasteland as an instrument of murder. It was the kind of cruelty that made decent men question their faith and wonder if there was any justice left in the world. But there would be time for justice later. Right now, Samuel was dying, and Emma wasn't far behind him. Colt opened his canteen and carefully lifted the boy's head, allowing a few drops of water to fall onto his cracked lips. Samuel stirred slightly, his tongue darting out to catch the precious moisture. "That's it," Colt murmured. "Just a little at a time." He looked up at Emma, who was watching him with an intensity that made his heart ache. "We need to get you both back to my ranch," he said. "Samuel needs more help than I can give him out here. Do you think you can ride if I help you up onto my horse?" Emma nodded without hesitation. "I can do whatever you need me to do, mister. I've been taken care of. Samuel, since Papa died last winter, I know how to be strong." The simple dignity in her words hit Colt like a physical blow. This child, barely out of infancy herself, had been carrying responsibilities that would challenge a grown woman. She'd kept herself and her brother alive in the Wasteland through pure determination and the kind of love that moves mountains. Looking at her, Colt saw something he hadn't seen in years, the face of genuine courage. He gathered Samuel into his arms, marveling at how light the boy felt, how fragile. The child's fever was burning through him like wildfire, and Colt could feel the rapid flutter of his heartbeat against his chest. There wasn't much time left. "Emma, I need you to climb up behind me and hold on tight," he said. "We're going to ride hard, and I need you to make sure you don't fall off." As they prepared to leave, Emma turned to look back at the spot where they'd been sheltering. "Mama told us to wait here," she said quietly. "She said someone would come for us, someone with kind eyes and gentle hands. She said his name would be like hers, something from the old country." Colt felt the world shift around him, as if the very ground beneath his feet had suddenly become uncertain. "What was your mama's name, Emma?" The girl looked up at him with those two wise eyes, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. "Sarah McKinnon. She said she used to live in Texas before the bad men took her away to California. She said if we were ever in trouble, we should look for a man named Colt, because he was the one she should have married instead of the man who sold her." The canteen fell from Colt's nerveless fingers, hitting the alkali dust with a soft thump that seemed to echo across the wasteland like thunder. Sarah McKinnon. The name he'd carved into a headstone 3 years ago, the woman he'd buried along with his dreams of family and future. But that Sarah had never been to California, had never mentioned having children, had died in their bed from fever while carrying their own unborn child. Unless there had been 2 Sarah McKinnons, unless the woman he'd married had been running from someone, a past she'd never shared with him, unless the life they'd built together had been founded on secrets that were only now rising from the wasteland like ghosts seeking redemption. Samuel stirred in his arms, mumbling something. "That sounded like Mama said you'd come." Emma was watching him with an expression of hope mixed with uncertainty, waiting for him to say something, to acknowledge the impossible connection that had brought them together in this place where nothing was supposed to survive. Colt looked down at the children, then up at the endless expanse of poisoned ground that surrounded them. The sun was getting lower, and the temperature was already beginning to drop. Whatever mysteries lay buried in the past would have to wait. Right now, he had 2 lives to save, 2 chances to finally fill the silence that had been eating away at his soul for 3 long years. He bent down and retrieved his canteen, then lifted Emma up behind him on Jasper's broad back. "Hold on tight, little miss," he said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't yet name. "We're going home." As they rode back toward the fence line, Colt found himself thinking about Sarah's words from that long-ago evening on the porch. "This land needs young voices. It's too quiet, too lonely. Children would wake it up, make it remember what it's supposed to be for." Maybe she'd been right. Maybe the wasteland hadn't given up these children to die, but had been holding them, protecting them, waiting for the right moment to deliver them to someone who could love them the way they deserved to be loved. Maybe this was Sarah's final gift to him, sent from whatever place the dead go when their work on earth is finished. The fence line came into view, and beyond it, the familiar outline of his ranch buildings against the darkening sky. For the first time in 3 years, Colt Brennan was riding home with passengers, and the silence that had become his constant companion was broken by the sound of children's voices, faint but unmistakably alive. Behind them, the wasteland stretched away into shadow, keeping its secrets and its promises, waiting for the next lost soul to wander into its embrace. But tonight, it had given back something precious, something that had been thought lost forever. Tonight the desert had remembered what mercy looked like. The ride back to the ranch house felt both endless and too short at the same time. Colt pushed Jasper as hard as he dared, but with 2 children clinging to him and Samuel's condition worsening by the minute, he couldn't risk the kind of breakneck gallop that might save precious time, but could also prove fatal if someone fell. Emma's small arms were wrapped around his waist with surprising strength, and he could feel her adjusting her grip every few minutes to better support her brother, who drifted in and out of consciousness against Colt's chest. The sun was painting the western sky in shades of amber and crimson by the time they reached the ranch buildings. Colt's spread wasn't the largest in the territory, but it was well maintained and functional, with a main house built of local stone and timber, a barn that could shelter 30 head of cattle during the worst weather, and a series of outbuildings that served various purposes. The windmill that pumped water from the deep well creaked steadily in the evening breeze, its familiar sound now carrying a note of urgency that seemed to match the beating of Colt's heart. He rode straight to the front porch, where he dismounted carefully and gathered Samuel into his arms once more. The boy was burning up with fever, his small body radiating heat like a stone that had been sitting in the sun all day. Emma slid down from Jasper's back with the kind of practiced ease that spoke of a childhood spent around horses, then immediately moved to Colt's side, her young face etched with concern for her brother. "We need to get him inside and cool down," Colt said, more to himself than to Emma, but the girl nodded as if she understood exactly what needed to be done. They climbed the porch steps together, Colt fumbling with the door latch while trying not to jostle Samuel too much. The front door swung open to reveal the interior of a house that had been built for a family, but had been lived in by a solitary man for too long. The main room was spacious but sparsely furnished, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a sturdy wooden table that could seat 8, but rarely saw more than 1 plate. The walls were bare except for a few practical items: a rifle rack, a mirror that had belonged to Sarah, and a single photograph of Colt and his late wife on their wedding day. The furniture was well made, but showed the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of a man who had nothing but time to spend on such details. Colt carried Samuel to the bedroom that had once been intended as a nursery, a room he'd avoided entering for months at a time since Sarah's death. The space was smaller than the master bedroom, but caught the morning light beautifully, and Sarah had spent hours planning how they would decorate it for their children. Now it served as a storage room, filled with furniture and belongings that Colt couldn't bring himself to throw away, but couldn't bear to look at every day. He cleared a space on the narrow bed that had been meant for hired hands, then laid Samuel down gently. The boy's breathing was even more labored now, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made Colt's stomach clench with fear. Emma immediately took her place beside the bed, her small hands reaching out to smooth her brother's hair away. From his fevered brow, "He gets like this sometimes," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of matter-of-fact tone that children use when they've been forced to become adults too quickly. "When he hasn't had enough water or food. Mama used to say his body just burns through everything too fast, like a fire that can't control itself." Colt nodded, though he suspected Samuel's condition was more severe than simple dehydration. The boy's symptoms suggested heat exhaustion at the very least, possibly progressing toward heat stroke. Without proper medical care, children had been known to die from far less severe exposure to the elements. "Emma, I need you to help me," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency he felt. "Can you fetch me some clean cloths from the kitchen? There should be dish towels in the drawer next to the wash basin." The girl nodded and hurried from the room, her bare feet making soft sounds on the wooden floor. Colt used her absence to examine Samuel more closely, checking his pulse and breathing, feeling for signs of delirium or other complications. The boy's heartbeat was rapid and thready, his breathing shallow but regular. His skin was hot to the touch but not completely dry, which suggested he hadn't yet reached the most dangerous stage of heat-related illness. Emma returned with an armload of clean cloths, moving with the kind of quiet efficiency that reminded Colt painfully of Sarah. His wife had possessed that same ability to anticipate what was needed in a crisis, to provide exactly the right help at exactly the right moment. "Good girl," he said, taking the cloths from her. "Now I need you to go back to the kitchen and fill that blue pitcher with cool water from the pump. Not cold, just cool. Can you work the pump handle?" "Yes, sir," Emma replied without hesitation. "I've been doing it since I was smaller than Samuel." She paused at the doorway, looking back at her brother with an expression that was far too mature for her young face. "He's going to be all right, isn't he, Mr. Brennan? I couldn't bear to lose him too." The simple faith in her voice hit Colt like a physical blow. This child had already lost so much, had been forced to carry burdens that would challenge grown men, and yet she was still capable of hope, still able to believe that good things could happen in a world that had shown her mostly cruelty. "I'm going to do everything I can for him," he promised, and meant it with every fiber of his being. While Emma fetched the water, Colt began the slow process of cooling Samuel's fevered body. He dampened one of the cloths and began wiping down the boy's face and neck, working carefully to avoid shocking his system with too rapid a temperature change. Samuel stirred at the touch of the cool fabric, his eyelids fluttering briefly before closing again. It was a small response, but it gave Colt hope that the boy was still fighting, still trying to hold on. Emma returned with the pitcher of water, along with a tin cup that she'd found somewhere in the kitchen. "I thought you might need this," she said, offering the cup to Colt. "Mama always said sick people need to drink little bits at a time, not too much all at once." Colt accepted the cup gratefully, marveling once again at the girl's maturity and presence of mind. "Your mama was a smart woman," he said, then carefully lifted Samuel's head and allowed a few drops of water to trickle into his mouth. The boy swallowed reflexively, his throat working weakly but steadily. "That's good," Colt murmured. "That's real good." They worked together in comfortable silence for the next hour, taking turns cooling Samuel's body and encouraging him to drink small amounts of water. As the evening wore on, the boy's breathing began to slow and deepen, his skin gradually losing some of its alarming heat. The fever hadn't broken completely, but it was no longer climbing toward the dangerous levels that had threatened his life. During a brief lull in their ministrations, Emma sat back in the chair Colt had pulled up beside the bed and looked around the room with curious eyes. "This was going to be a baby's room, wasn't it?" she asked quietly. "I can tell by the way it's set up and that cradle in the corner." Colt followed her gaze to the oak cradle he'd carved with his own hands, now partially hidden behind a stack of boxes and covered with a layer of dust. He'd forgotten it was in here, had trained himself not to see it during his infrequent visits to this room. "Yes," he said simply, "my wife and I were expecting a child, but she died," Emma finished gently. "I'm sorry. I know what that feels like." There was no pity in her voice, no awkward attempt to offer comfort she was too young to understand. Instead, there was a simple recognition of shared grief, an acknowledgement that loss was something they both carried. Colt found himself more moved by her understated sympathy than he would have been by elaborate condolences from well-meaning adults. "Tell me about your mama," he said, settling into the chair beside Emma's. Samuel's breathing had stabilized enough that Colt felt comfortable taking a brief break from the constant monitoring. "You said her name was Sarah McKinnon. What else do you remember about her?" Emma's young face took on a distant expression, as if she were looking back through years rather than days. "She was beautiful," she said. "Really beautiful, with dark hair and eyes like green glass. She could sing like an angel, and she told the best stories, but she was sad a lot too. She used to cry when she thought Samuel and I weren't looking, especially when she talked about Texas." Colt's chest tightened at the description. The Sarah he'd known had possessed dark hair and green eyes, had been known throughout the county for her lovely singing voice. But his Sarah had been happy, at least during their time together. She'd never mentioned being sad about Texas, had never given him reason to think she was running from anything or anyone. "Did she ever talk about a man named Colt?" he asked, trying to keep his voice casual despite the turmoil of emotions roiling inside him. "Someone she might have known before she went to California?" Emma nodded immediately. "All the time. She said he was the kindest man she'd ever met, that he had gentle hands and a good heart. She said she made a terrible mistake by not staying with him, that she let her father talk her into leaving when she should have been brave enough to fight for what she wanted." The words hit Colt like bullets, each one finding its mark with devastating accuracy. He remembered now the day Sarah had left, the sudden departure that had broken his heart and left him wondering what he'd done wrong. Her father, Hamish McKinnon, had been a hard man with strong opinions about his daughter's future. He'd never approved of Colt, had considered him too poor and too common for his precious Sarah. "She said her father made her marry someone else," Emma continued, her voice growing softer as she relived painful memories. "A man named Garrett Walsh, who had money and connections but no kindness in him. She said it was the worst mistake of her life, that she spent every day regretting it." Garrett Walsh. Colt knew the name, had heard stories about the man who'd made his fortune in questionable ways during the California gold rush. Walsh had a reputation for being ruthless in business and cruel to anyone who depended on him. He'd thought of his Sarah trapped in a marriage to such a man made Colt's hands clench into fists. "What happened to this Garrett Walsh?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "He sold her," Emma said simply, her young voice carrying a weight of knowledge that no child should possess. "When he got tired of her, when she couldn't give him what he wanted, he sold her to men who traffic in women. She tried to take us with her when she ran, but they caught us. That's how we ended up in the Wasteland." The room fell silent, except for the sound of Samuel's steady breathing and the distant creaking of the windmill outside. Colt stared at the wall, trying to process what he'd just learned. The woman he'd loved and lost had been alive all these years, living a nightmare existence while he'd been mourning her as dead. She'd borne children, had tried to build a life under impossible circumstances, and in the end, she'd been murdered by the very people who were supposed to protect her. "She never stopped loving you," Emma said suddenly, as if she could read his thoughts. "Even when things were at their worst, she would tell us stories about the ranch in Texas and the man who'd treated her like a queen. She said that someday, when we were older, she would find a way to bring us back here, to introduce us to the father we should have had." Colt felt tears burning behind his eyes, a grief so profound it threatened to crush him where he sat. All these years, he'd been living as a widower, building a monument to a dead woman who had actually been suffering in ways he couldn't even imagine. If he'd looked harder, if he'd tried to find her instead of accepting her father's explanation, that she'd chosen someone else, might he have been able to save her? "She made us memorize this address," Emma continued, "made us promise that if anything ever happened to her, we would find our way to the Double Bar B ranch and look for Colt Brennan. She said you would take care of us, that you were the only person in the world she trusted completely." The weight of responsibility settled on Colt's shoulders like a heavy blanket. These children weren't just random orphans he'd found in the wasteland. They were the family he'd never had, the legacy of the woman he'd never stopped loving. Sarah had sent them to him across impossible distances and through unthinkable hardships, trusting that he would honor the love they'd shared by protecting the most precious things she'd left behind. Samuel stirred on the bed, his eyes fluttering, open for the first time since they'd arrived at the ranch. "Emma," he whispered, his voice barely audible but unmistakably stronger than it had been hours earlier. "I'm here, Samuel," Emma said, immediately moving to his side and taking his small hand in hers. "We're safe now. We found him just like Mama said we would." The boy's eyes found Colt's face, studying him with the serious expression that seemed to run in the family. "Are you Colt?" he asked, his voice growing slightly stronger as he spoke. "I am," Colt replied, moving to kneel beside the bed so he could meet the boy at eye level. "And you're Samuel. Your mama told you about me, didn't she?" Samuel nodded weakly. "She said you were brave and kind, and that you would keep us safe from the bad men. She said you would love us like we were your own children." The simple trust in the boy's voice was almost too much to bear. Colt reached out and gently touched Samuel's forehead, relieved to find that the fever had continued to subside. "Your Mama was right," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You're safe now, both of you, and I'm going to make sure you stay that way." As the evening deepened into night, Colt found himself settling into a routine that felt both foreign and familiar. He helped Emma prepare a simple meal of soup and bread, marveling at her competence in the kitchen and her natural ability to care for her brother. Samuel was able to sit up and eat a few spoonfuls of broth, his appetite returning along with his strength. They ate together at the big wooden table that had been silent for so long, and for the first time in 3 years, Colt heard the sound of children's voices echoing through his home. Emma told stories about their travels, carefully edited versions that left out the worst of what they'd endured, but gave Colt a sense of the courage and resilience that had kept them alive. Samuel listened with the kind of attention that suggested he'd heard these stories before, that they were part of the family mythology that had sustained them through their darkest hours. After dinner, Colt helped Emma settle Samuel back into bed, then made up a makeshift sleeping arrangement for the girl in the main room. He offered her his own bed, but she refused, insisting that she needed to be close to her brother in case he needed her during the night. Her dedication to Samuel was both touching and heartbreaking, a reminder of the adult responsibilities she'd been forced to shoulder at such a young age. As he tucked them both in, Colt found himself thinking about the future for the first time in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would shape the rest of their lives. But tonight, for the first time since Sarah's death, his house felt like a home again. The silence that had haunted him for so long was broken by the sound of children's breathing, by the soft whispers of a sister comforting her brother, by the promise of voices that would fill the empty spaces in his heart. Standing in the doorway between the main room and the bedroom, Colt looked out at the 2 children who had appeared in his life like a miracle wrapped in tragedy. They were his responsibility now, his family, the answer to prayers he'd been afraid to speak aloud. Whatever dangers lay ahead, whatever challenges they would face together, he would meet them with the same determination that had carried him. Through war and grief and the long, lonely years of exile from hope, the Wasteland had taken his Sarah, but it had also given him her children. In the strange arithmetic of the frontier, that felt like a kind of justice, a balancing of accounts that had been long overdue. Tomorrow would bring new tests of his resolve, but tonight, Colt Brennan was no longer alone. Tonight, he had a family to protect, and that made all the difference in the world. Dawn came early to the Texas territory, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that transformed the harsh landscape into something almost beautiful. Colt had been awake for hours, sitting on his front porch with a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold, watching the sun climb above the distant mountains and listening to the sounds of his ranch coming to life. The cattle were stirring in the far pastures. Their lowing carried on the morning breeze, and somewhere in the barn, one of his horses was nickering softly, probably demanding breakfast. But for the first time in 3 years, Colt wasn't alone. With the sunrise, from inside the house came the quiet sounds of children waking up. Emma's soft voice as she checked on Samuel, the creak of floorboards as small feet found their way across unfamiliar rooms, the whispered conversations that spoke of a lifetime spent looking out for each other. These were sounds Colt had dreamed of hearing in this house, sounds that Sarah had promised would someday fill their home with life and purpose. The screen door opened behind him, and Emma emerged onto the porch, her dark hair braided back from her face and her clothes, the same torn and dusty garments she'd been wearing when he found them. She moved with the careful quiet of a child who had learned not to disturb sleeping adults. But there was also a confidence in her bearing that suggested she was comfortable claiming her place in this new environment. "Good morning, Mr. Brennan," she said politely, settling onto the porch step beside his chair. "Samuel's feeling much better today. His fever broke completely during the night, and he's asking for something to eat." Colt felt a wave of relief wash over him. He checked on the boy several times during the dark hours, monitoring his breathing and temperature, but hearing that Samuel was actively hungry was the best news he could have hoped for. "That's wonderful, Emma. I'll get breakfast started in just a few minutes. How are you feeling? You've been through quite an ordeal yourself." The girl considered the question with the seriousness she seemed to bring to everything. "I'm tired," she admitted. "And scared, I guess. Not of you," she added quickly, as if afraid he might misunderstand. "You've been nothing but kind to us. But I keep thinking about what happens next. Where we'll go, what we'll do. Samuel and I have been on our own for so long I'm not sure we remember how to be part of a family." The honesty in her words pierced Colt's heart. These children had been forced to survive in ways that would challenge grown adults, had learned to depend only on each other in a world that had shown them precious little kindness. The idea of trust, of letting someone else take care of them, must seem almost impossibly foreign after everything they'd endured. "Emma," he said, turning in his chair so he could look directly at her, "I want you to understand something. This is your home now, yours and Samuel's, for as long as you want it to be. I'm not going to send you away, and I'm not going to let anyone else take you from here. Your mama sent you to me, and I intend to honor that trust." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back with the kind of determination that reminded Colt painfully of Sarah. "But why?" she asked. "You don't really know us. We're not your responsibility. Why would you want to take on 2 strange children when you've been living alone for so long?" It was a fair question, one that deserved an honest answer. Colt looked out over his land, thinking about the years of solitude, the nights spent wondering if his life would ever have meaning again, the gradual acceptance that he was destined to live and die alone. "Because I loved your mama," he said finally, "more than I've ever loved anyone or anything in my life. When she left, when I thought she'd chosen someone else, it nearly broke me. Learning that she was forced into that marriage, that she spent all those years wanting to come back here, changes everything." He paused, collecting his thoughts, trying to find words that would make sense to a 10-year-old girl who had already seen too much of the world's cruelty. "But more than that, Emma, I think you and Samuel are the answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. This house has been too quiet for too long. It needs children's voices, needs laughter and questions, and the kind of chaos that only a family can bring. You're not a burden, you're a gift." Emma studied his face with those 2 wise eyes, as if she were trying to determine whether his words could be trusted. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she nodded slowly and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Mama always said you were special," she said. "She said you were the kind of man who meant what he said and did what he promised." I think she was right. Before Colt could respond, Samuel appeared in the doorway, his small face pale but alert, his eyes bright with curiosity about his new surroundings. He'd managed to wash his face and hands, and someone had attempted to comb his hair, though it still stuck up in rebellious cowlicks that made him look younger than his 7 years. "Good morning, sir," Samuel said with the kind of formal politeness that suggested he'd been well taught in manners despite his difficult circumstances. "Emma says you're going to let us stay here. Is that true?" Colt stood and walked over to the boy, kneeling down so they could speak eye to eye. "It's true, Samuel. This is your home now, and I'm going to take care of both of you, but I need you to do something for me. I need you to stop calling me Sir and Mr. Brennan. Those are names for strangers, and we're not strangers anymore. Can you call me Colt?" Samuel considered this request with the same gravity his sister brought to important decisions. "Mama used to say your name like it was something precious," he said. "She would get a faraway look in her eyes when she talked about you. I think she would like it if we called you Colt." The simple acceptance in the boy's voice nearly undid Colt's composure. He reached out and gently ruffled Samuel's unruly hair, marveling at how natural the gesture felt. "Then Colt it is. Now, how about we get some breakfast into both of you? I make pretty good flapjacks, and I've got maple syrup that came all the way from Vermont." The next few hours passed in a blur of domestic activity that felt both foreign and wonderfully familiar. Colt found himself remembering skills he'd thought he'd forgotten, ways of moving around a kitchen that accommodated small helpers, the patience required to answer the endless questions that curious children asked about everything they encountered. Emma proved to be remarkably competent for her age, helping with the cooking and setting the table as if she'd been doing such tasks her entire life. Samuel was less helpful, but more entertaining, offering a running commentary on everything he observed and displaying the kind of fearless curiosity that only children possessed. After breakfast, Colt took them on a tour of the ranch, showing them the barn where his horses lived, the chicken coop that would provide them with fresh eggs, the workshop where he repaired equipment and crafted the furniture that filled their house. Samuel was fascinated by everything, asking questions about how things worked and why they were necessary, while Emma observed with the practical eye of someone who understood that knowledge meant survival. In the pasture behind the barn, they encountered Colt's small herd of cattle, sturdy animals that had been bred for the harsh conditions of the territory. Samuel had never seen cattle up close, and his excitement was infectious as he watched the massive animals graze peacefully in the morning sun. Emma was more cautious, staying close to Colt's side, but even she seemed charmed by the gentle nature of the beasts that formed the foundation of their new guardian's livelihood. "They're so big," Samuel breathed, his eyes wide with wonder. "Do they ever get angry and chase people?" Colt chuckled at the boy's concern. "Not these ones," he assured him. "They're used to people, and as long as you're respectful and don't make sudden movements, they'll mostly ignore you. But it's important to always be careful around any large animal. They don't mean to hurt people, but they're strong enough to do damage accidentally." As they walked among the cattle, Emma asked practical questions about the business of ranching, how many head Colt owned, how he sold them, what the challenges were of raising livestock in such harsh country. Her questions revealed a sharp intelligence and a natural understanding of the economic realities that governed their new life. Colt found himself explaining concepts he'd never thought to discuss with children, but Emma absorbed every detail as if she were filing it away for future reference. "Mama always said we needed to understand how people made their living," Emma explained when Colt commented on her astute observations. She said knowledge was the only thing nobody could take away from you, so the more you learned, the safer you'd be. It was a harsh lesson for a child to learn, but Colt could see the wisdom in it. Sarah had been preparing her children for a world that offered few guarantees, teaching them to be self-reliant and observant in ways that might someday save their lives. The fact that they'd survived their ordeal in the Wasteland was testament to how well she'd succeeded in that education. After the tour, they returned to the house for lunch, and Colt began to see how easily the children adapted to their new environment. Emma immediately began exploring the kitchen, familiarizing herself with where things were kept and how the various appliances worked. Samuel discovered the collection of books that Sarah had accumulated, running his fingers along the spines, with the reverence of someone who understood the value of the written word. "Can you read?" Colt asked, settling into his chair and watching the boy examine the volumes. "Yes, sir. Yes, Colt," Samuel replied, correcting himself with a shy smile. "Mama taught us both. She said reading was like having conversations with the smartest people who ever lived, even if they were dead. Emma's better at it than I am, but I'm getting stronger every day." Emma looked up from her exploration of the pantry. "Mama made us practice every night, no matter how tired we were or how bad things got. She said education was the one thing that could lift us above our circumstances, that it didn't matter where we came from, if we could think and learn and grow." Colt felt another wave of admiration for the woman he'd lost and found again through her children. Even in the worst of circumstances, Sarah had continued to be a mother in the truest sense, not just providing for her children's physical needs, but nurturing their minds and spirits as well. It was exactly the kind of thing she would have done, the kind of determined optimism that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. As the afternoon wore on, Colt began to see glimpses of the children Emma and Samuel might become, if they were allowed to simply be children for a while. Samuel's natural curiosity flourished in the safe environment of the ranch, and he peppered Colt with questions about everything from the habits of prairie dogs to the mechanics of the windmill that pumped their water. Emma remained more reserved, but Colt caught her smiling at her brother's enthusiasm, and once, when Samuel successfully helped her hang laundry on the line behind the house, he heard her laugh with genuine joy. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the wasteland, Samuel climbed onto Colt's lap with the unconscious trust that only children possessed. The boy was still weak from his ordeal, and the day's activities had tired him more than he wanted to admit, but his spirits were clearly improving by the hour. "Colt," Samuel said, his voice drowsy with approaching sleep, "do you think Mama can see us from heaven? Do you think she knows we found you?" The question hit Colt like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it so perfectly captured the mixture of grief and hope that seemed to define their new family. "I think she can," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think she's watching over all of us, making sure we take care of each other the way she would want us to." Emma had been sitting quietly on the porch steps, but now she looked up at them with tears in her eyes. "She used to say that love was the only thing stronger than death," she said. "She said that even if something happened to her, the love she had for us would keep us safe and help us find our way to where we belonged." As full darkness settled over the ranch, Colt carried the sleeping Samuel inside and helped Emma prepare for bed. The domestic routine felt both strange and wonderful, a return to rhythms he'd thought were lost to him forever. As he tucked Samuel into the narrow bed in what had once been intended as a nursery, the boy stirred and mumbled something that sounded like, "Thank you, Papa." The word stopped Colt's heart for a moment. Papa. Not Colt, not Mr. Brennan, but Papa. It was a title he'd never expected to claim, a role he'd thought had died with his unborn child 3 years ago, but hearing it from Samuel's lips felt like a benediction, a sign that perhaps the God he'd stopped believing in after Sarah's death hadn't forgotten him after all. Later, as he sat alone on the porch under a canopy of stars, Colt found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't dared to imagine for years. There would be challenges ahead, he knew. 2 traumatized children didn't heal overnight, and there were practical considerations about their legal status, their education, their need for medical care and proper clothing, and all the countless details that went into raising a family. But for the first time since Sarah's death, Colt felt like he had a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. He had children to protect, minds to nurture, hearts to heal. He had the chance to honor Sarah's memory by giving her children the kind of life she would have wanted for them, the kind of stable, loving home that had been stolen from all of them by forces beyond their control. The wasteland stretched out. Beyond his property line, dark and seemingly endless under the starlight. Somewhere out there, Sarah's bones lay in an unmarked grave, her dreams of returning home buried with her in the harsh ground that had claimed so many others. But her children were here, safe and loved, and already beginning to bloom under the care she'd dreamed of providing. In the distance, a coyote howled, its voice carrying across the empty miles like a lament for all the things that had been lost. But tonight, Colt didn't hear it as a sound of mourning. Tonight it sounded like a song of welcome, a recognition that the silence had finally been broken and the long years of waiting were over. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight his house was full of life again, and that was miracle enough for any man. 3 weeks had passed since Colt found the children in the wasteland, and the Double Bar B ranch had transformed from a monument to loneliness into something resembling a real home. Emma had proven herself invaluable in managing the household, her natural competence extending to everything from mending clothes to helping with the evening milking. Samuel had gained weight and color, his laughter now a regular sound that echoed across the property as he chased chickens or helped Colt with the lighter ranch duties. For the first time in years, Colt had begun to believe that happiness might be something more than a distant memory. That belief shattered on a Tuesday morning when Deputy Marshal Franklin Wade rode up to the ranch house, his badge gleaming in. The early sunlight and his expression carrying the kind of grim determination that Colt recognized from his war days. Wade was a career lawman, the sort of man who followed orders without question and interpreted the law with the rigid literalness that made him effective, but not necessarily just. Colt had met him a few times in Copper Ridge, had always found him to be competent, but lacking in the kind of flexibility that frontier life often demanded. "Morning, Brennan," Wade said as he dismounted from his bay gelding, his hand resting casually on the butt of his Colt revolver. "Got some business to discuss with you, official business." Colt had been repairing a section of fence near the house when Wade arrived, and he set down his tools with deliberate care, his instincts already alerting him to danger. Emma and Samuel were inside, helping with the breakfast dishes, but he could see Emma's face at the kitchen window, her expression worried as she took in the scene. "Deputy Wade," Colt replied, his voice neutral but wary. "What brings you all the way out here? It's not often we see law enforcement on this side of the territory." Wade pulled a folded document from his jacket pocket, the official seal of the territorial government visible even from a distance. "Got a writ here, signed by Judge Morrison over in Austin. Seems there's been some questions raised about those 2 children you've got living with you. Questions about their legal status and whether you've got any right to be keeping them." Colt's blood turned to ice in his veins. He'd known this moment might come, had even planned for it to some degree, but hearing the words spoken aloud still hit him like a physical blow. "What kind of questions?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Well, for starters, there's no record of you being appointed as their legal guardian," Wade said, unfolding the document and scanning. its contents. No paperwork filed with the territorial authorities. No formal custody arrangements. Far as the law's concerned, you're harboring 2 runaways, maybe even kidnapping victims. The accusation hung in the air between them like smoke from a gunshot. Colt felt his hands clench into fists, the old military discipline warring with a surge of protective rage that threatened to overwhelm his better judgment. Those children aren't runaways, and they sure as hell aren't kidnapping victims. I found them dying in the Wasteland and brought them home. Their mother is dead, and they have no other family. Wade's expression didn't change, but Colt caught something in his eyes that might have been sympathy. That may be true, Brennan, but it's not what the paperwork says. According to this complaint, the children were taken from their legal guardian without permission. There's a man named Vincent Carver, claims to be their uncle, says he's been looking for them ever since they disappeared from California. The name hit Colt like a sledgehammer to the chest. Vincent Carver was one of Garrett Walsh's associates, a man known throughout the territory for his involvement in human trafficking and other unsavory enterprises. If Carver was claiming kinship with Emma and Samuel, it could only mean one thing. He intended to finish what Walsh had started, to collect on whatever debts their mother had supposedly incurred. Vincent Carver is no kin to these children, Colt said, his voice deadly quiet. He's a criminal who makes his living buying and selling human beings. If you turn Emma and Samuel over to him, you'll be signing their death warrants. Wade shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving away from his weapon, as if he suddenly realized the conversation had taken a more serious turn than he'd anticipated. That's a serious accusation, Brennan. You got any proof of what you're saying? Before Colt could answer, the screen door of the house banged open and Emma emerged onto the porch, her young face set in lines of determination that reminded him painfully of her mother. Samuel followed close behind, his small hand clutching his sister's dress as if she were his anchor in a suddenly uncertain world. "Mr. Wade," Emma said, her voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. "I heard what you said about Mr. Carver, and I need you to know something. That man isn't our uncle. He worked for the people who killed our mama, and if you make us go with him, he'll sell us just like they tried to sell her." Wade looked genuinely startled by the girl's intervention, his official composure wavering in the face of her obvious sincerity. "Now, miss, that's a mighty serious thing to say about a man. You sure you got your facts straight?" Emma stepped forward, her chin raised in defiance. "I saw him, Deputy Wade. I saw him talking to the men who took Mama away. He was there when they decided we were too much trouble to bother with, when they left us in the Wasteland to die. He's not trying to rescue us. He's trying to collect us like we're stray cattle." Samuel nodded vigorously, his young voice piping up in support of his sister's testimony. "He has mean eyes and gold teeth, and he smells like tobacco and something. Rotten. Mama was scared of him, really scared. She made us promise to hide if we ever saw him again." Wade looked from the children to Colt, his expression troubled. The deputy was many things, but he wasn't stupid, and even he could see that the children's fear was genuine. "This is getting complicated," he admitted. "The writ I've got here says I'm supposed to take custody of the children pending a hearing before Judge Morrison, but if what you're all saying is true—" "It is true," Colt said firmly, "every word of it. Vincent Carver is using the legal system to get his hands on these children for reasons that have nothing to do with their welfare. You take them away from here, Deputy, and you'll have their blood on your hands." Wade folded the writ and tucked it back into his jacket, his movements slow and deliberate as he considered his options. "I've got my orders, Brennan, but I also got a duty to protect citizens from harm. Tell you what, I'm going to ride back to town and send a telegram to Judge Morrison. Ask him to look into this Carver fellow's background before we proceed. Give me a few days to sort this out." Relief flooded through Colt, but he was careful not to let it show on his face. A few days wasn't much, but it was better than having the children dragged away immediately. I appreciate that, Deputy, and I want you to know that I'll cooperate fully with any legitimate investigation. These children deserve protection, not exploitation. After Wade rode away, Colt gathered Emma and Samuel on the front porch, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges they would face in the coming days. The deputy meant well, but he was a small cog in a large machine, and there were forces at work that were far more powerful and ruthless than one territorial lawman could. "Hendel, are they going to take us away?" Samuel asked, his young voice trembling with fear. "Are we going to have to go back to the bad men?" Colt knelt down and pulled both children into his arms, holding them close as he tried to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Not if I can help it," he promised. "But we need to be smart about this. There are people who want to hurt you, and they're using the law to try to get what they want. We have to be ready for anything." Emma pulled back slightly, her green eyes serious and determined. "What can we do? We're just children, and they have papers and badges and judges. On their side, it was a fair question and one that went to the heart of their dilemma. In the territory where justice was often determined by whoever had the most money or the best connections, the truth wasn't always enough to protect the innocent. But Colt had learned a few things during his years as a soldier and a rancher, had developed resources and relationships that might prove useful in the fight ahead. "First thing we're going to do is get you both some proper legal protection," he said. "There's a lawyer in Austin named Margaret Sinclair who specializes in cases involving children and families. She's got a reputation for taking on powerful interests and winning. I'm going to send her a telegram today. Ask her to represent us in court." Emma nodded approvingly. "That's good. But what if they don't wait for the courts? What if they try to take us before we can get to a judge?" The question revealed a maturity beyond her years, an understanding of how the world worked, that no child should have to possess. But it also showed that Emma was thinking strategically, that she understood the stakes and was prepared to fight for her and Samuel's freedom. "Then we'll be ready for them," Colt said grimly. "This ranch has good sight, lines and defensible positions. I've got weapons and ammunition, and I know how to use them. But more importantly, I've got friends in this territory, people who owe me favors and won't stand by while children are harmed." That afternoon, Colt rode into Copper Ridge to send his telegrams and begin calling in those favors. The town was typical of frontier settlements, a collection of wooden buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained. The telegraph office was located in the general store, run by an elderly German immigrant named Klaus Zimmermann, who had a reputation for discretion and reliability. "Need to send a couple of messages, Klaus," Colt said, pulling out a piece of paper on which he'd written the text of his telegram to Margaret Sinclair. "First one goes to Austin, to a lawyer named Sinclair. It's urgent." Zimmerman read the message, his eyebrows rising as he took in the contents. The telegram was brief but comprehensive, explaining the situation with the children and requesting immediate legal representation. "This is serious business, Colt," the old man said. "You sure you want to get tangled up in territorial politics?" "I don't have a choice, Klaus. Those children are my responsibility now, and I'll do whatever it takes to protect them." The second telegram went to Colonel James Morrison, Colt's former commanding officer, who now served as a territorial judge in a different district. Morrison was a fair man with a strong sense of justice, and Colt hoped he might be able to provide some insight into Judge Morrison's background and motivations. After sending the telegrams, Colt made his way to the Silver Dollar Saloon, where he knew he'd find Tom Bradley, a former cavalry sergeant who now worked as a freelance scout and occasional bounty hunter. Bradley was sitting at his usual table in the back corner, nursing a whiskey and reading a week-old newspaper. Tom, Colt said, settling into the chair across from his old comrade. I need a favor. Bradley looked up from his paper, his weathered face creasing into a grin. Captain Brennan, as I live and breathe, heard you'd turned into a hermit out there on your ranch. What brings you to town? Colt quickly explained the situation, watching as Bradley's expression grew increasingly serious. The two men had served together through some of the worst fighting of the war, had developed the kind of trust that only came from shared danger and mutual dependence. Vincent Carver, Bradley said, when Colt finished his story. Yeah, I know. That name. He's bad news, Captain. Runs a network of traffickers and slavers that stretches from California to New Orleans. If he's after those kids, it's not for any good reason. Can you help me gather information on him? Background, associates, recent activities. I need ammunition for the legal fight that's coming. Bradley nodded without hesitation. Consider it done. I've got contacts throughout the territory, people who keep track of scum like Carver. Give me a couple of days, and I'll have everything you need. As Colt rode home that evening, he found himself thinking about the battles he'd fought during the war. The times when victory had seemed impossible, but had been achieved through determination, planning, and the support of good people willing to stand up for what was right. This was a different kind of war, fought with legal documents instead of bullets, but the stakes were just as high. Emma and Samuel were waiting for him on the porch when he arrived, their faces anxious but hopeful. He dismounted and walked over to them, pulling both children into a fierce embrace. Did you find help? Emma asked. I found the beginning of help, Colt replied. We've got people working on our side now, good people who understand what's at stake, but it's going to be a fight, and we need to be prepared for anything. That night, as he tucked the children into bed, Samuel looked up at him with eyes that held too much knowledge for his young age. Colt, the boy said quietly, if the bad men come, will you fight for us? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication and hope. Colt reached out and gently smoothed the boy's hair, his voice steady and sure when he answered. Samuel, I fought battles for causes I barely understood, for ground that didn't matter and principles that belonged to other men. But I've never had anything worth fighting for like I do now. If they want to take you and Emma away from here, they're going to have to go through me first. The boy smiled and closed his eyes, finally allowing sleep to claim him. But Colt remained awake long into the night, his mind working through strategies and contingencies, preparing for a battle that would determine not just the fate of two orphaned children, but the very meaning of family, justice, and redemption in a land where all three were rare and precious commodities. The telegram from Margaret Sinclair arrived on Thursday morning, carried by a rider who'd been paid extra to deliver it without delay. Colt tore open the yellow envelope with trembling fingers, Emma and Samuel flanking him at the kitchen table as he spread the message flat and read aloud the words that would determine their fate. Investigation reveals Vincent Carver suspected in multiple trafficking cases. No blood relation to children established. Filed emergency injunction with territorial court. Hearing scheduled Monday, Austin Courthouse. Do not surrender children under any circumstances. Armed escort arranged. Trust no one until I arrive. Monsieur Sinclair, attorney at law. Emma let out a breath she'd been holding for days, her small shoulders sagging with relief. Samuel clapped his hands together, his young face lighting up with hope for the first time since Deputy Wade's visit. But Colt felt a chill run down his spine as he read between the lines of the lawyer's message. The phrase, "trust no one," suggested that Carver's influence ran deeper than they'd imagined, that even law enforcement couldn't be relied upon to protect the children. What does it mean about an armed escort? Emma asked, her practical mind immediately focusing on the details that would affect their safety. It means Mrs. Sinclair understands how dangerous this situation really is, Colt replied, folding the telegram carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket. She's sending men she trusts to make sure we get to Austin safely, men who aren't connected to the territorial law enforcement that Carver might have corrupted. Before anyone could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the ranch. Yard. Colt moved to the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the Winchester rifle that now lived within easy reach of every room in the house. What he saw made his blood turn to ice. Deputy Wade was returning, but this time he wasn't alone. 3 other men rode with him, including a figure that Colt recognized from wanted posters as Vincent Carver himself. Carver was a man who wore his evil-like expensive clothing, well-tailored and carefully maintained. He sat his horse with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted through intimidation and corruption. His face was lean and predatory, marked by the gold teeth that Samuel had described, and eyes that seemed to calculate the monetary value of everything they saw. Even from a distance, Colt could sense the casual cruelty that made Carver so dangerous. "Emma, Samuel," Colt said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded troops in battle. "I need you both to go to the root cellar behind the kitchen. There's a hidden panel in the back wall that leads to a tunnel. If things go bad here, you follow that tunnel to the old mine shaft and wait for Tom Bradley. Remember what I taught you about the signals." Emma's face went pale, but she nodded, with the kind of mature understanding that still broke Colt's heart. "What about you?" she asked. "I'm going to talk to these men and try to resolve this peacefully. But if that doesn't work, I want you and Samuel somewhere safe." He knelt down and pulled both children into a fierce embrace. "Remember, no matter what happens out there, you are not alone. There are good people fighting for you, and we will not let the bad men win." The children disappeared through the back door just as the riders reached the front porch. Colt stepped outside, the Winchester cradled in his arms, but not yet raised in an openly threatening position. Deputy Wade dismounted first, his face troubled and apologetic, followed by Carver and 2 men who had the look of professional gunfighters about them. "Mr. Brennan," Wade began, his voice strained with obvious reluctance, "I've got new orders from Judge Morrison. This here is Vincent Carver, the children's uncle, and I'm instructed to turn them over to his custody immediately." Carver stepped forward with the smooth confidence of a man accustomed to intimidating others. "Mr. Brennan, I appreciate the care. You've shown my niece and nephew during their difficult time, but they belong with family now. I've come a long way to collect them, and I don't intend to leave empty-handed." "Is that what you call it?" Colt replied, his voice deadly quiet. "Collecting them? Like they're livestock you've purchased at auction." Something dangerous flickered in Carver's eyes, but his smile never wavered. "I'm not sure what you're implying, Mr. Brennan, but I assure you my intentions are entirely honorable. Emma and Samuel have been through a terrible ordeal, and they need the stability that only family can provide. The same kind of stability you provided their mother when you sold her to human traffickers." The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and Colt saw the mask slip from Carver's face for just an instant, revealing the predator beneath the civilized veneer. Wade looked genuinely shocked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon as he began to understand the true nature of the situation. "That's a serious accusation, Brennan," Carver said, his voice still smooth but carrying an undertone of menace. "I hope you can back it up with something more substantial than the fantasies of traumatized children." Before Colt could respond, Tom Bradley's voice cut across the tension like a knife. "How about bank records showing payments from known traffickers to your California accounts? Or witness statements from 3 different brothel owners who remember buying women from your organization?" Bradley emerged from behind the barn, a rifle in his hands and a grim smile on his weathered face. Behind him came 2 other men that Colt didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the purposeful bearing of professional soldiers. The odds had suddenly shifted, and everyone present understood that the situation had moved beyond legal maneuvering into something far more dangerous, Carver's two gunmen tensed, their hands hovering near their weapons, but Bradley's companions already had them covered. Deputy Wade looked back and forth between the two groups, clearly out of his depth and beginning to realize that he'd been manipulated into a situation that was far more complex than a simple custody dispute. "Deputy Wade," Bradley said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. "I've got documents here that prove Vincent Carver is wanted on federal charges related to human trafficking. That makes this a federal matter, which means your territorial warrant is worthless." Wade's face went through a series of expressions as he processed this information, relief warring with embarrassment at having been used. "Is this true?" "He," asked Carver, "are you wanted by federal authorities?" Carver's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the cold calculation that was his true nature. "Deputy, I suggest you remember who has the proper legal documentation here. These men are criminals attempting to interfere with a lawful custody transfer." "The only criminal here is you, Carver," a new voice said from the direction of the main road. Margaret Sinclair rode into the ranch yard on a black mare, her traveling dress dusty from hard riding, but her bearing as dignified as if she were entering a courtroom. Behind her came a man wearing a federal marshal's badge, his presence instantly changing the legal dynamics of the confrontation. "Marshal Thompson, U.S. Marshal Service," the newcomer announced, dismounting and walking directly to where Carver stood. "Vincent Carver, you're under arrest for violations of federal statutes regarding the transportation of persons across state lines for immoral purposes." What happened next occurred with the speed and violence that characterized life on the frontier. Carver's gunmen, realizing that their employer was about to be arrested and that their own freedom was in jeopardy, went for their weapons. Bradley and his companions responded instantly, their military training evident in the smooth way they brought their rifles to bear. The gunfight was brief but intense. Carver's men were skilled, but they were outnumbered and caught in an exposed position with nowhere to take cover. The sound of gunfire echoed across the ranch yard, sending the cattle in the distant pastures into panicked motion and bringing Emma and Samuel's faces to the small window of the root cellar. When the smoke cleared, both of Carver's gunmen were down, one clearly dead and the other wounded and disarmed. Carver himself had tried to use Deputy Wade as a human shield, but the deputy had proven more resourceful than anyone expected, breaking free and tackling the criminal to the ground. Marshal Thompson had his prisoner in custody within minutes, the federal warrant he carried trumping any territorial legal maneuvering. "It's over," Colt called toward the root cellar, his voice carrying clearly across the sudden silence. "You can come out now. It's safe." Emma and Samuel emerged from their hiding place like small ghosts, their faces pale, but their eyes bright with the kind of relief that comes only after a long nightmare finally ends. They ran to Colt, who gathered them into his arms and held them close, feeling their small hearts beating against his chest like captured birds finally set free. Margaret Sinclair approached the family group with the confident stride of a woman accustomed to winning difficult cases. She was younger than Colt had expected, probably in her early 30s, with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of presence that commanded attention in any room she entered. "Mr. Brennan," she said, extending her hand, "I'm Margaret Sinclair. I believe we have some legal matters to discuss." As Marshal Thompson led Carver away in shackles, Colt found himself thinking about the strange twists of fate that had brought them all to this moment. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken man living alone with his ghosts, convinced that his life held no purpose beyond mere survival. Now he stood surrounded by allies who had risked their lives to protect 2 children he'd come to love as his own. "What happens now?" Emma asked, looking up at the lawyer with the kind of direct gaze that demanded honest answers. Margaret Sinclair knelt down to meet the girl at eye level, her expression serious but kind. "Now we make sure that what happened to your mother never happens to anyone else, and we make sure that you and Samuel have the kind of safe, permanent home that every child deserves." Deputy Wade approached the group, his hat in his hands, and his face flushed with embarrassment. "Mr. Brennan, I owe you an apology. I was doing what I thought was right, following proper legal procedures, but I see now that I was being used. That man fooled a lot of people with his forged documents and false credentials." Colt nodded, understanding the deputy's position. "You were doing your job, Wade. The fault lies with the people who corrupted the system, not with the men trying to uphold it honestly." As the sun began to set over the Double Bar B ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Colt stood on his front porch with Emma and Samuel beside him. The crisis had passed. The immediate danger was over, but he knew that the real work was just beginning. There would be legal proceedings to navigate, official guardianship papers to file, and the long process of helping two traumatized children heal from the wounds that life had inflicted on them. But for the first time in years, Colt felt genuine hope for the future. The house that had been silent for so long was now filled with the sounds of family, and the land that Sarah had loved was finally serving its intended purpose as a place where children could grow up safe and loved. Tom Bradley joined them on the porch, accepting a cup of coffee and settling into one of the wooden chairs that Sarah had chosen years earlier. "Well, Captain," he said, using Colt's old military title, "looks like you've got yourself a family again." Colt looked down at Emma and Samuel, who were leaning against him with the unconscious trust that only children possessed. "I reckon I do," he said quietly, "and this time I'm not going to let anyone take them away." As full darkness settled over the ranch, they moved inside to begin preparing dinner together, the three of them working in the kind of comfortable synchronization that spoke of a family that had found its rhythm. The kitchen that had once echoed with loneliness now buzzed with conversation and laughter, the empty spaces filled with the kind of love that Sarah had always dreamed would inhabit their home. Outside, the wasteland stretched away into darkness, keeping its secrets and its promises. But tonight, it had given back everything it had taken, and more besides. Tonight, the desert had remembered what redemption looked like, and in a house where three people had learned to be a family, the impossible had finally become possible. 6 months after the confrontation that had changed their lives forever, Colt Brennan stood in the doorway of what had once been his storage room, watching Emma carefully arrange wildflowers in a mason jar beside the window. The space had been transformed from a repository of painful memories into a proper bedroom for her, complete with a bed he'd crafted from local oak, a writing desk where she practiced her letters, and shelves lined with the books that Margaret Sinclair had shipped from Austin. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating the girl's face as she worked, and Colt marveled at how much she'd changed since that first desperate day in the Wasteland. The legal proceedings had taken months to fully resolve, but Margaret Sinclair had proven as formidable in the courtroom as she'd been in orchestrating Carver's capture. Vincent Carver himself was now serving a 20-year sentence in federal prison, his human trafficking network dismantled and his assets seized. To compensate his victims, the forged custody documents that had nearly torn Emma and Samuel away from their new home were exposed as part of a larger conspiracy that reached all the way to California, resulting in the removal of several corrupt officials from their positions. More importantly, for the children's future, Judge Morrison had formally granted Colt full legal guardianship, a process that had been expedited by the testimony of key witnesses and the overwhelming evidence of the children's well-being under his care. The papers sat framed on the mantel now, beside a photograph of Sarah that had been joined by newer images of their growing family. Emma and Samuel Brennan, the documents read, and seeing their names legally linked to his still-filled Colt with a wonder that bordered on disbelief. Papa Colt, Samuel called from the kitchen, using the hybrid title that had evolved naturally from his original Papa and Emma's more formal Colt. The boy's voice carried the kind of excitement that usually meant he'd discovered something fascinating or gotten into mild trouble. "Come see what I found in the barn." Colt made his way to the kitchen, where Samuel stood beside the table holding a small wooden box that Colt recognized with a jolt of painful memory. It was one of Sarah's jewelry boxes, carved with intricate roses and fitted with a tiny brass lock. He'd thought all of her personal belongings had been stored in the attic, but apparently this one had found its way to the barn during one of his grief-stricken attempts to clear the house of reminders. "I was looking for that rope you asked me to find," Samuel explained, his young face serious with the weight of discovery, "and I saw this behind some old feed sacks. It was wrapped in cloth, like someone was trying to protect it. There's writing on the bottom." Emma appeared in the doorway, drawn by the conversation, and moved to examine the box with the careful attention she brought to anything that might be historically significant. Her education had progressed remarkably under the tutelage of Miss Catherine Wells, the schoolteacher who rode out from Copper Ridge twice a week to instruct the children of the more remote ranches. Emma had proven to be exceptionally bright, with a particular aptitude for mathematics and natural science that reminded Colt of her mother's practical intelligence. "It says, 'For my children, with all my love, Sarah McKinnon Brennan,'" Emma read, aloud, her finger tracing the delicate script carved into the wood. "Papa Colt, this belonged to your wife, didn't it? Your first wife, I mean." The distinction was important to Emma, who had worked hard to understand the complex family dynamics that had brought them together. She'd been the one to suggest that they refer to Sarah as our first mama and themselves as her children too, creating a narrative that honored both the woman who had given birth to them and the woman who had made their current happiness possible. Colt took the box with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of memories and might-have-beens. The lock had long since corroded, and the lid opened easily to reveal the contents that Sarah had intended for the children they'd never had together. Inside were a pair of wedding rings, delicate gold bands that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, along with a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon and a small leather journal filled with Sarah's handwriting. "She wrote to you," Emma said softly, examining the letters with the reverence she showed for all written words. "Look, they're addressed to my dearest children and dated, Papa Colt. Some of these are from after she died. How is that possible?" Colt opened the journal with hands that shook as if he were defusing a bomb. The pages were filled with Sarah's careful script, entries that began shortly after their marriage and continued almost until the day she died. But as Emma had observed, some of the entries were dated after Sarah's funeral, written in a hand that was similar but not identical to his late wife's. "This isn't possible," he whispered, then stopped as he recognized the truth. "It's not Sarah's. Handwriting in the later entries, it's someone else's, someone who wrote like her, but not exactly like her." Emma leaned closer, her sharp eyes picking out the subtle differences that Colt's grief had initially obscured. "The letters are different shapes," she said, pointing to specific words, "and the way she makes her G's is different in the later entries. Papa Colt, I think someone else was writing in this journal, someone who knew your wife's handwriting well enough to imitate it." Samuel, who had been listening with the patient attention he brought to anything that might explain the mysteries of their family history, suddenly spoke up with startling clarity. "Our first mama told us that she learned to write by copying letters from a woman in Texas who had beautiful handwriting. She said it reminded her of home, practicing those letters over and over until she could write just like her." The pieces fell into place with an almost audible click. Sarah McKinnon, the woman who had borne Emma and Samuel, had learned to write by copying the handwriting of Sarah McKinnon Brennan, the woman who had died in Colt's arms 3 years earlier. The later entries in the journal weren't written by a ghost or through some supernatural intervention. They were written by a woman who had taken comfort in maintaining a connection to the life she'd been forced to leave behind. Colt opened to one of the later entries, dated just weeks before the children's mother had died, and read aloud in a voice thick with emotion. "My dearest children, if you are reading this, it means you have found your way to the man I should have married, the one who will love you, as I have loved you. His name is Colt Brennan, and he has the gentlest hands and the strongest heart of any man I have ever known. Trust him, for he will never betray that trust. Love him, for he has known great sorrow and deserves great joy. And remember that even though I am gone, the love I have for you will live on in the family you will become together." Emma was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face as she processed the magnitude of what her mother had done. "She knew," the girl whispered. "Somehow she knew we would end up here. She prepared for it, even when it seemed impossible." Samuel, young as he was, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He moved to Colt's side and took his hand, his small fingers warm and reassuring. "So our first mama and your first wife were like sisters, even though they never met," he said, with the kind of simple wisdom that only children possessed. "And that makes us all family in a special way." Over the following weeks, the journal became a bridge between past and present, a way for all three of them to understand the incredible chain of events that had brought them together. The earlier entries, written by Colt's Sarah, revealed her dreams for the children she'd hoped to have, her plans for their education and upbringing, her fierce determination to create a legacy of love that would outlast her own brief life. The later entries, written by the children's mother, showed how she'd drawn strength from those dreams, how she'd used them as a template for raising Emma and Samuel even under the most difficult circumstances. The revelation transformed their understanding of their family in profound ways. They were no longer just three people thrown together by circumstance and tragedy. They were the fulfillment of dreams that had been shared across time and distance by two women who had never met, but who had loved the same man and wanted the same things for the children they would never see grow up. As spring arrived on the Double Bar B Ranch, bringing with it the kind of renewal that made even the harsh Texas landscape seem beautiful, Colt found himself planning for a future that extended far beyond mere survival. The ranch was prospering under his careful management. The cattle herd had grown to nearly 300 head, and he'd begun to consider expanding into horse breeding, a venture that would allow Emma and Samuel to develop their own expertise. In animal husbandry, Emma had shown remarkable aptitude for the business side of ranching, keeping meticulous records of expenses and profits, corresponding with buyers in distant markets, and even suggesting innovations that improved efficiency. Her dream was to attend the University of Texas in Austin, a goal that seemed entirely achievable given her intellectual gifts and Colt's growing financial stability. Samuel, meanwhile, had developed an almost supernatural ability to work with animals. Horses that were skittish with other people became calm and cooperative under his gentle hands, and he'd begun training a young colt that Margaret Sinclair had given him as a birthday present. His ambition was to become a veterinarian, a profession that would allow him to travel throughout the territory, helping ranchers and farmers care for their livestock. The transformation of the ranch extended beyond its economic success to its role in the community. Word had spread about the family that had been forged in the Wasteland, and other people with nowhere else to go had begun finding their way to the Double Bar B. There was Maria Santos, a young Mexican woman who had escaped an abusive marriage and now served as the ranch's cook and housekeeper. There was old Pete Morrison, a former cavalry trooper who had lost his pension to a bureaucratic error and now helped with the horses in exchange for room and board. There was even a small family of German immigrants who had homesteaded on the edge of Colt's property and gradually became part of the extended community that centered around the ranch house. "We're becoming what Mama always said we would," Emma observed one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "A place where lost people can find their way home." Colt nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. The wasteland still stretched beyond his property line, still claimed its share of the desperate and the unlucky, but it had also proven capable of redemption, of giving back what it had taken. The children who had been abandoned to die in its harsh embrace had become the foundation of something larger than any of them could have imagined. As the months passed, visitors began arriving at the ranch with increasing frequency. Some were officials from Austin, drawn by the remarkable story of the family that had survived human trafficking and corruption to find happiness in the most unlikely of places. Others were journalists and writers seeking to document a tale that seemed to capture something essential about the American frontier experience. Margaret Sinclair became a regular guest, her legal practice having evolved to focus specifically on cases involving endangered children, and her friendship with the family had deepened into something approaching kinship. But the most significant visitor arrived on a crisp October morning, riding a paint horse and carrying a telegram that would change their lives once again. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell was a professor of social work from the University of Chicago, a woman who had dedicated her career to studying innovative approaches to child welfare. She had read about the Brennan family in a newspaper article and had traveled halfway across the country to see their operation firsthand. "Mr. Brennan," she said, after dismounting and accepting his offer of coffee on the front porch, "I believe you've created something here that could serve as a model for child welfare throughout the country. The way you've integrated traumatized children into a stable family structure, the community support network you've developed, the emphasis on education and practical skills, it's exactly what reformers have been advocating for years." The proposal she outlined was both exciting and daunting. Dr. Hartwell wanted to establish a formal partnership between the Double Bar B Ranch and the University of Chicago, creating a training center where social workers and child welfare advocates could learn the techniques that had proven so successful with Emma and Samuel. The ranch would receive significant funding. The children would have access to educational opportunities that would have been unimaginable just a year earlier, and Colt would have the chance to share his experience with others who were working to protect vulnerable children. "What do you think?" Colt asked Emma and Samuel that evening as they discussed the proposal around the dinner table. "It would mean big changes for all of us. More people, more responsibility, more attention from the outside world." Emma considered the question with her characteristic seriousness. "I think our first mama would want us to help other children the way we were helped," she said finally. "And I think your first wife would be proud to see her dreams becoming bigger than she ever imagined." Samuel nodded enthusiastically. "And maybe some of those children would be good with animals like me. We could teach them about horses and cattle, and they could help us build something even better." 6 months later, the Double Bar B Children's Ranch was officially established, with Colt as its director and Emma and Samuel as its first success stories. The main house had been expanded to accommodate additional children. A proper schoolhouse had been built near the original ranch buildings, and a staff of trained professionals had been recruited to help with the complex work of healing young lives that had been damaged by trauma and neglect. The operation attracted attention from across the country, with delegations of social workers, government officials, and philanthropists making regular visits to observe the innovative programs. that had been developed. But for all the recognition and expansion, the heart of the enterprise remained the same, a commitment to providing love, stability, and opportunity to children who had been abandoned by a system that should have protected them. As Colt stood in the doorway of the original ranch house one evening, watching Emma help a newly arrived child with her reading lessons, while Samuel taught another boy how to properly curry a horse, he felt the kind of deep satisfaction that came from knowing his life had meaning and purpose. The wasteland that had taken so much from him had also given him everything that mattered, and the blessing that had seemed inexplicable on that first desperate day now revealed itself as the logical outcome of love, determination, and the mysterious ways that broken things could be made whole again. The sun was setting over the Texas territory, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that never failed to remind him of Sarah's paintings, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack. But tonight, the sound didn't speak of loneliness or loss. Tonight, it sounded like a celebration, a recognition that the desert had finally remembered what it was for, and that the impossible had become not just possible, but inevitable. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.